The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm so happy to welcome back to the show once again, Sophie. Sophie, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me back. It's my, third or fourth time on here at this point. I feel like I speak to you all the time. It's great.
Right, you have now reached first name status. I don't have to say your whole
Yes.
name. You are just Sophie now.
Yes, well, you always did a really good job of pronouncing my surname. A lot of people struggle to. So right from the off, you had it.
I did. Now
yeah,
I'm done. I've
Sophie.
already done it.
Yeah. So anyone who's not heard of me before or seen me on the show is just like, Sophie who?
Yeah, Sophie who? Sophie Bacchus-Waterman.
That's right. Yes. And we're here to talk about Anne Boleyn Psalter, aren't we, today?
Yeah, so let's start off because when we discussed doing this as a topic, the first thing I said, well, I went to Catholic church growing up. I should have a pretty good idea. And then I thought, what is a Psalter? So let's start with that. What exactly is a Psalter?
No, it's a really good question because I didn't know until I started doing the topic for my dissertation. So I first looked into Anne Psalter for my dissertation and my master's in book history. And a Psalter is a book of Psalms. So there's lots of different kind of devotional books that were used during Anne's life and during the medieval period. You've got books of hours, and they sort of recorded prayers that were said at certain times of day. And then you've got Psalters, which were books of Psalms. You might have missals, which had songs in them. You might have a Psalter hours, so that's got the Psalms and prayers. So they're all different kind of combinations. But the Psalter of Anne Boleyn, as its name suggests, is just a Psalter, just a book of Psalms. And it was written in French as well. It's got these manuscript, these beautiful manuscript Psalms.
Okay, so it's Anne Boleyn's. It's in French. So does this tell us it's from earlier on in her life, or is this when she was queen?
This is earlier, sort of before she was queen, but not as early as you think. So it was given to her, it must have been given to her at the earliest in 1531, because the manuscript was copied from a printed source text, which was published in 1531. So it's been historically dated to between 1529 and 1532, because the reason we know it's Anne's as well is because it's got this heraldry in it. As you open it up, it's this beautiful thing. It's incredible. As you open it up, on the first page, you've got Anne's heraldry being held up by two angels on a shield, and that's the heraldry that she used between 1529 and 1532, when she was Anne Rochford, when she was Lady Rochford. When her father was Lord Rochford, and Anne used the title Anne Rochford. So that's that heraldry. That's how we can date it. But it was copied from a book that was printed in 1531. So it must have been given to her at the earliest between 1531 and 1532. So quite late in her life, but just before she became queen.
Yeah. And so for those who maybe don't follow the church or church rituals, explain where this book would come in handy. I mean, you've named the different kinds of books that she could have, which would basically be like a library of church books. But where does the Psalter come into play?
The Psalter comes into play because you might want to read the Psalms privately or as a group. Psalters might be used collectively if you all had a copy of the same book. And Anne's one includes Anne's one has music in it as well. So they might have been sung, the Psalms. And it was just a form of prayer and mindfulness, almost as we might like to think of it today, to pray and to go to the Psalms at times of trouble, or, times when you might need direction in prayer, that sort of thing. Much like Christians who use the Psalms today, they're incredibly powerful texts, whether you're a Christian or not. So really, they were just kind of a form of devotion.
Yeah. So these books also were like little works of art too, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. And Anne's one is no exception. So I mentioned the opening with the heraldry on it, which is just beautiful. It's so colourful. The manuscript actually was recently on display at the National Portrait Gallery as part of the Six Wives exhibition, I think it was called.
Yeah.
So some of the listeners might have seen it there. And there's images online as well. If you just Google the Psalter of Anne Boleyn, you'll get two, because she had two. You will get the small girdle book with the gold binding. It's not that one. It's the other one that's currently held at Wormsley Library. So it's beautifully illuminated. There are little initials throughout with gold leaf on them and kind of dark blue and dark red ink. There's these beautiful small, and so they include Anne's heraldry, but they also there's some of them which include HA, the initials HA, intertwined together, which, as I'm sure a lot of listeners know, Anne and Henry adopted that insignia during their marriage and just before, because Anne couldn't have obviously any sort of symbols of queenship. So things like the falcon that we see in later books that she owned, like Harley MS 6561 at the British Library, which was a book that her brother George gave to her. That includes her heraldry as queen. Things like the white falcon that she adopted. But this manuscript, because it was slightly earlier, doesn't quite include images of her that she adopted as queen. But because you've got Anne and Henry's initials intertwined together, that shows very clearly that, the intention was there. She was queen in all but name at this point, but just couldn't quite go all that way with that imagery. And yeah, it's just beautifully illuminated. There's 2 full-page illuminations, the one with heraldry, and then the full-page shield, which shows the HA intertwined together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so was there any scribblings in this one like there was in the Book of Hours?
There was not, no. And it's funny you mentioned the Book of Hours, actually, because it was Kate McCaffrey's research into Anne's Books of Hours that inspired me to do my dissertation on Anne Psalter. Because when I was just finishing up my master's, I was searching around for a subject, and that was when Kate's research was being publicised. And I thought, that's amazing that we can still learn so much from these books. I've loved the Tudors since I was a child, and just think like maybe I could do something like that. And when you look into books owned by Anne, there are very brief mentions of her Psalter. Professor James Carley, whose book, The Books of Henry VIII and His Wives, which was a great book on the subject, mentions the Psalter very briefly. And even Eric Ives, in his biography, he briefly talks about it when he talks about Anne's books. But there wasn't much on it out there academically recently. So when I went to go and look at it, I was fully under the impression like maybe there's some hidden inscriptions somewhere, maybe there's something that someone has missed. And that's not what ended up being the case. So it's completely and utterly clean. It's devoid of all annotations. It's as if Anne was given this book and it was just put on, she went, oh, thank you very much, and kind of put it on a shelf and never touched it. Which is really interesting because no later owners inscribed it either. If Anne in her lifetime didn't, but everyone else who owned it after her, and unfortunately we have no signs of who that was because no one wrote their names in it at all. The only sign we have of later provenance before it turns up for sale in 1972 in Paris is the rebinding, which occurred about 100 years after Anne's death in the 1630s in London. That's all we know about it. It's completely blank of any annotations by Anne or anybody else, which in itself is very interesting.
Wow. So a rebinding, then we're looking at roughly 100 years after she originally received it, right?
Yes.
So I guess I don't know what was the original binding made of? Do we know?
We don't know because there's no evidence of it at all left. It was probably velvet. Looking at other contemporary royal bindings or kind of upper class bindings at that time. Upper class is the wrong word. Upper echelons of society, I suppose. The kinds of books that Anne would have owned and the kind of surviving bindings that we have. It probably was some kind of velvet binding, but there's no evidence of it at all survived it. The book's been completely rebound.
Interesting.
Its rebinding is very beautiful, but yeah.
I just find it so interesting that some of the bindings from 100 years prior to that had survived at this point. Like it makes me wonder what was going on with her copy that it was in such a disarray.
It is really interesting to wonder, perhaps if it was a velvet binding, it might have been damaged. If it was textile binding, they might have felt the need to rebind it. If it was in disarray for some reason, or it might have been somebody choosing to do that for personal reasons. The rebinding itself is really interesting. And I've actually just published a paper, the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America, that's a mouthful, on the binding of Anne Psalter, because it's really interesting. It was rebound in an embroidered binding, which in itself is very beautiful. It's kind of cream off-white colour with in the center of it is the symbol of the pelican in her piety, which has been embroidered into the cover and the back cover as well. And then around it is all these flowers and little sequins and stars and things like that. It's a beautiful thing. And that symbol is so interesting because the symbol of the pelican in her piety was a symbol of a symbol of Christianity, a symbol of martyrdom. There was a contemporary belief that pelicans fed their children from the blood of their breasts, which was understood as a metaphor for Christ. And when you think about that in the context of Anne and the context of Elizabeth, her daughter, it gets really interesting. Because obviously by the time Anne's Psalter was rebound in the 1630s, Elizabeth had her reign. And so then you think about, if someone rebound this in the 1630s, shortly after Elizabeth I's death, it makes you think about why would they have done that? Perhaps it was an act of, of commemoration, because the owner of the manuscript had to know that it belonged to Anne Boleyn, because as I said, it's full of her heraldry. If you owned that, you knew where it came from. And so someone in London in the 1630s decided, for whatever reason, to rebind Anne's Psalter with a binding with that particular image on it, the image of the pelican in her piety, which was a symbol of martyrdom, a symbol of Christianity, a symbol of motherhood. And it's just so interesting to think, could they have had a motive for choosing that particular decoration? During Elizabeth I's reign, you've got a kind of rehabilitation of Anne Boleyn's image as not a traitor, but as a martyr, the mother of the Queen, who was martyred, and then Elizabeth I came to the throne. So that's just really interesting to think about with the binding and the symbolism behind it. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's all these hidden messages that continue to happen between Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth. It feels like we're looking at the exchequer ring again, right? And it's wondering who is the image of the woman inside that ring. I don't think we're ever going to find out who it is.
No, nor do I. But it's just that's one. I mean, I'm a believer that it's Anne in that ring, but everyone wants it to be Anne, don't they? I've heard lots of arguments for and against, but there's all these links between Anne and Elizabeth. Now, to clarify, Elizabeth I didn't own it. There's no evidence to suggest that it was hers. When it first went up for sale in Paris in 1972, the catalogue record suggests that Elizabeth I made the embroidered binding herself. But that was before it was dated. It wasn't dated at that point. And obviously we know Elizabeth I did a lot of embroidered bindings herself. It's lovely to imagine, but there's nothing to suggest that it was her work or that she knew anything about it. It was probably owned by somebody else. But it's interesting that it links Anne and Elizabeth together kind of accidentally. When you think about Elizabeth I herself and how she utilised the image of the pelican in her piety as well, obviously you've got the famous pelican portrait by Hilliard, and the idea of mother shedding its blood, their blood for their children, and Elizabeth I utilising the idea of herself as a martyr, herself as being willing to die for the country. When you think about her Tilbury speech as well, there's a lot of symbolism behind the binding, which may have been intentional on the part of whoever it was that chose to rebind it. Yeah,
I want to know who did it.
I wish we knew. I wish we knew. Just have no idea. All we know is that it was a London bindery. There's an almost identical binding, which still survives in the Bible Society's collection. I believe it's at Cambridge, and they are almost identical. So they're both the same. They were done by the same workshop. You put them next to each other, they're almost identical. Anne's Psalter and this other Bible. But besides that, we don't know. London 1630s, no idea. Possibly a woman, I will say, because embroidered bindings were considered quite a feminine thing. They were often owned by women. So it's interesting to imagine that it might have been a woman, perhaps somebody who knew Anne, because it's a very personal item to own. It survived the sequestration of Anne and George's belongings after their executions. It didn't end up in the Royal Library because, like I say, it disappears. So Anne and George's belongings were all taken and subsumed into the Royal Library. James Carley's done a lot of work on that. It's why we have, a lot of books that were owned by Anne and George still in the British Library today, because they were in the Royal Library, in the Royal Collection. So that didn't happen to Anne's Psalter. Somebody must have kept it safe taken it away, just like Anne's books of hours, and how they survived, and they're not in the British Library, they went in the Royal Collection. Somebody must have rescued it from that kind of collecting of Anne's belongings. And completely speculating wildly, maybe someone had it at the time of Anne's execution, maybe she lent it to them, who knows? But then they kept it safe, and then 100 years later, when it was rebound, it's still in London. At some point, somehow, it gets from London to Paris within, that huge gap of time where we know nothing. And then it comes obviously back to England, and now it's held in Wormsley Library in Buckinghamshire. So we don't know who it was.
I think I figured it out.
Go on, who do you think it was? Go on, you figured it out. Go on.
So it would, maybe Anne Boleyn gave it to her mother before she was executed. Just a way for me to bring up Elizabeth Boleyn.
Elizabeth Boleyn. That's lovely, isn't it? It's lovely to imagine. We'll bring up Elizabeth Boleyn. That's a very natural segue. Go ahead.
Okay, so initially I thought maybe it was in the Royal Collection and that's how it was kept safe for so long, but you've made that clear that was not. So then I thought, well, maybe it went to a family member, somebody who would cherish it for, how it should be cherished, who better than a mother, but she didn't live much longer after. Did she?
No, not much longer. She passed away in 1538. But it's possible, that it remained in the family. As to bring up Kate's research again, we know that there were women who kept Anne's books safe, who wrote in them after her death. Local Kentish gentlewomen who kept Anne's books safe. It's possible that her Psalter is one of those as well. That it was kept safe immediately afterwards. It's interesting because there is no provenance evidence. Nobody wrote their names in it. Nobody wrote prayers in it. It is completely clean. Which just, I don't know why that's the case. We don't know why nobody wrote in it. You think that they might have done. It would have been helpful for us now if they had 500 years later.
Yeah.
But we know nothing. Yeah, other than the fact it was in London in the 1630s.
Oh, that's so challenging because we don't. It's just all speculation.
All speculation. There's just no evidence. But what the binding does tell us, the rebinding does tell us, is that it's very, it was kept safe. Somebody wanted to rebind it and then keep it safe. And that binding has survived for all that time since then. And the fact that it's not been written in at all may in itself be informative because it might have been kept as a treasured possession that you don't write in, that you keep safe, that you keep in good condition. Because like I say, it is a remarkable condition. When you see it, it's almost as if it's hardly been handled, which might be telling. It might have been kept safe and not touched. Everyone has like a favorite book or something that they take out on special occasions. It might have been like that it was protected and not written in as an act of commemoration.
Yeah, or like a family heirloom.
Or a family heirloom, exactly. I went into looking at the Psalter fully believing and hoping that I would find where it was, that I would fill that gap of time. At the moment, I just don't think it's possible. There's just no evidence. There's just none. It's very frustrating because it was sent to Sale, the Library Lardanche. Oh, my French pronunciation is dreadful. I apologise to any listeners. In Paris in 1972. And it was sent by an anonymous collector. So that leads nowhere. Because obviously if you knew who had it in the 70s, then you could trace it backwards from there. But it was an anonymous collector and there's nothing there either. It's very frustrating. Yeah, it's very strange. Yeah, these things that just survive, and then they pop up. Because until 1972, it was unknown to academics, this manuscript. It was just unknown. And because there's no provenance evidence in it, because it's just been overlooked a little bit in recent scholarship. Like I say, James Carley's magnificent book on the books of Henry and his wives barely mentions it. I think he gets a brief paragraph. So it's just interesting that this manuscript has been overlooked. And yeah, fully encourage everyone to go and look at pictures. And I've got the paper on the binding that's recently come out. I've got another one coming out in a couple of months on the potential commissioner of the Psalter. So yeah, it's very exciting, and I hope that it kind of encourages people to think about it more.
I just cannot get around the fact that this thing existed and nobody seemed to know. So did it ever show up in any of the royal inventories? Like if we look at the 1542, nothing in there either?
Nothing in there, or at least nothing in there that is immediately identifiable. So in the Royal Inventory, you've got, for example, a Psalter bound in red velvet or whatever the inventory might say. There's nothing particular enough that kind of, because there were hundreds of books, right? There were so many books in that inventory. And it doesn't say, a Psalter in French, such and such. There's nothing about it. And because it doesn't have its original binding or anything like that, there's no way. I suppose you could identify it if the person taking the inventory said, Psalter with the late Queen's heraldry on it or something like that. But it doesn't. It's nothing there. I checked in the hopes that possibly it was in the Royal Inventory, but there's nothing to suggest that it was.
Yeah.
Which in itself is interesting because it was already out of Henry's clutches, by the time the inventory was done and wherever it was kept for that time.
Let's figure this out. Let's figure this out.
I wish we could. We'll solve it now. We'll solve it now. I tried. We just don't know. But it is a beautiful item anyway. And for me, the binding tells us quite a lot. The fact that it's not its original binding. Somebody bothered to have it rebound and take care of it. And at that particular point, when you've got, like I was talking about, the imagery of motherhood, the imagery of Christianity, the idea of the pelican as a symbol of martyrdom, on Anne's book specifically, it suggests whoever owned it, had that image of Anne as a martyr, which had been happening during Elizabeth I's reign, the kind of transformation from the image of Anne as a traitor to a martyr, with things like William Latimer's Chronicle of Anne Boleyn and John Fox's Book of Martyrs, the transformation of Anne into a martyr, and then for somebody to rebind not any book, but a devotional book, a particular book of Psalms, with that symbol is very telling. So although we don't know who that is, it still suggests the idea of like Anne's cultural image had changed by the time you reached the 1630s. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I love that idea. Here we are, and it's, let's say almost 100 years after her execution, and people are looking at her in the way that they probably should have been during her lifetime.
Absolutely. And with Elizabeth I's reign as well, and the idea of Anne kind of had to change culturally because she was the Queen's mother now, and so she became venerated in a way that she wasn't, immediately after her execution. And you can see that in the binding of this particular manuscript, that whoever did that chose that particular religious motif for this book. It's very interesting. And the idea of an embroidered binding being quite a tactile object when you touch it, it invokes the physicality of the manuscript, if you understand what I'm saying. You hold the binding and it's got these sequins on it. It's very soft. And in touching it, that's sort of part of an act of prayer. If you're reading the Psalms, you're holding the manuscript. It's not like you're just placing it down on a table and opening it up. You're holding it and feeling it. And it's all very interesting, the idea of like the physicality of that devotional act that could have been done if somebody used it during prayer in that way.
Have you seen this in person?
I have, yes, insanely, twice. I work with some great books in my job. We've done another episode on that. But this was the first time that I actually saw a manuscript like this in person as a researcher, that really made me go, gosh, that's incredible. Because when I was doing my dissertation, that would have been 2020. But it was kind of in between lockdowns and, the funny period when things were opening up again and then closing again, and especially over here in England, it was a bit different. And I got in touch with the wonderful librarian Brian Maggs at Wormsley Library, and I explained I was doing my dissertation on Psalter of Anne Boleyn. I would really like to come and see it. And he said, yeah, of course, I think he said we're open like on Thursdays, whatever it was, whatever day of the week it was. And then was able to organise a visit, got a bus over and went into this incredible library. I mean, Wormsley is beautiful. Again, listeners, Google images of that place. It's beautiful. Wall to wall, floor to ceiling, beautifully bound books, and a big fireplace, and just this huge space with carpet, and the outside looks like a castle, a small castle on the grounds of the Wormsley estate. And you go in, and there was a table at the back of the room, and on it was Anne's Psalter, just lying there. This, as I've described to you, this beautiful embroidered manuscript with this image on it, and then the librarians, they left me to it, and I was able to look through the manuscript by myself and sort of make notes. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to write about yet, but just to see it in person and hold it, it really is remarkable. When you think hundreds of years ago at one point and held this book, and then it passed through so many hands, and we're so lucky that we still have it today. And it makes you wonder as well, because this particular manuscript was unknown, as I say, until 1972. What else could still be out there? Let alone the stuff that's gone missing, from Hever and various sort of things we know existed, and then they sort of drop off the map. It makes me excited to think what might still be out there and might still be discovered.
Yeah, that is exciting. When you look at this, when you had this first opportunity to look at Anne Psalter and you opened it up, describe to me the feeling of looking at this. Like, visually, what did you see? How did it make you feel emotionally? I think you kind of hinted at that, but let's just paint the whole picture.
Of course, yeah. So I opened it up and I didn't know what to expect when you open it up, because there was no catalogue. There is a catalogue available of it. There's a catalogue of the books at the Wormsley Library. And that's another place, well, if anyone wants to see pictures, that's a great one. But I hadn't read that at this point, so I didn't know what to expect. Sit down and opened it very carefully. I hadn't had much manuscript handling experience at this point. This was prior to my current job at St. John's College in Oxford. And I had some experience through my master's, but this was the first time I'd really been left to my own devices as a researcher to look at something so precious. And so I will say probably the overwhelming feeling was fear, because you're thinking, gosh, I'm being allowed to do this. Someone take this away from me. That was there very much so. But then you open it and realize, actually, it's not going to fall apart. It's okay. And just this beautiful, I've described, the opening page with the heraldry. You see the same heraldry. So there's no images, I don't believe, of that particular page freely available online. But you see the same heraldry in Harley MS 6561 at the British Library, and you can find images of that. It's that heraldry, the shield. And it's so beautiful and bright with the ink. It's like it was made yesterday. And it's both a feeling of reverence is too grand, I don't know. Or I suppose just, feeling so lucky to be there and holding this thing, and also a feeling of disbelief, like almost it might be pretend. This can't really have been owned by Anne Boleyn. They've made this up, right? It's fake. But at the same time, knowing that it's not, that it's real, that it really was once upon a time owned by Anne Boleyn, and here I am, 500 years later, in front of this and holding this, and how fortunate we are that it still survives, and how it's had such a long existence. I still feel this when I handle some of the books that I deal with at work. It's had such a long existence, and you are just a temporary custodian or a temporary viewer in this item's long life. And if it could just talk, and share with you what it knows as an item, I would say all of that was kind of happening. And then as I sort of became more familiar with the manuscript and how it opened and how it felt, and realizing that it's not going to fall apart as you handle it, you can look through it. Just so impressive. Such a beautiful thing that's been so wonderfully preserved over the years. Yeah, it really is amazing. So, very long answer.
No, I love that. Did you notice any wear to the book? Like it was something that had been used? I mean, I know you talk about how it looked like it was preserved so well over the years. I'm just curious if there was any wear to it.
There is some wear. There's natural wear that you get from all manuscripts when you handle vellum over a period of time. You particularly see it in the corners where people have turned the pages, who knows how many times. It gets a sort of shiny look to it. And Psalter had some of that, if I remember rightly, which is just natural, wear from its lifetime. But the vellum itself was actually very, very good condition, which suggests how expensive it would have been. Not only would it have been expensive because it's full of, these small initials that I say that are very highly decorated with the beautiful gold leaf and the ink and all of that, which suggests that it would have been expensive. You've got line fillers as well, which is if a page, almost like justifying the text. If a line of text doesn't fill the entire block, then the illuminator has gone in and added a line of ink to colour it in and make it so that it's square like that. That will suggest it's very expensive, but the vellum itself was very good condition. There were no holes, there were no repairs, that sort of thing that you might see in a manuscript that was less expensive, because they would have used cheaper vellum that would have been more likely to tear, or might have had holes in it during the process that it's made into vellum. Anne's manuscript, every page was completely full and with no tears or holes or anything like that. So there were some signs of wear, but like I say, not as much as you might expect. Yeah.
Was Anne Salter I don't know if you know the answer to this, but was it a special order, or was this something that was made by an assembly line?
So I don't actually know the answer to that. I have another paper forthcoming in the Royal Studies Journal at some point this year, in a couple of months, suggesting that it was commissioned by George for Anne. Because it, as a text, so because it's French and because of its translation, it would have been considered an evangelical text, very similar to the likes of Percy MS 456 or Harley 6561, two manuscripts that we know George gave to Anne through James Carley's research, and they are both kind of evangelical texts as well, translations of biblical texts. And because Anne Salter is the same, falls into that category. And because we know that George gave Anne other beautifully illuminated manuscripts of that sort of that devotional type, it's possible to suggest that George also commissioned this for Anne. I think it's probably likely. It's possible that Anne commissioned it for herself as well. But that's as much as I can say about that. That it may have been a gift from George to Anne, which is also so touching as well when you think about the fact that it survived, and the fact that we know that there are two other books that George gifted to Anne. Those two others are mentioned, and then this one as a potential third as well. That's three that survived, two of which were definitely, and then the Psalters as likely, were gifted to Anne by George. And off the top of my head, there are 9 manuscripts that were owned by Anne. We know were personally owned by Anne, if I remember correctly. And potentially 3 of those were gifts from her brother to her. That's just lovely. That just really speaks to the sibling bond. It's very nice.
Yeah, it does. I don't think any of my brothers would buy me any books.
It's certainly not something as personal in this highly decorated, expensive thing, which is another thing as well to suggest that George gave it to Anne, because it's such an expensive manuscript. It would have needed to have been gifted to her by somebody with the means to commission something like that. And a personal thing as well. So it would have had to have been somebody who knew her well enough to know that she would have appreciated and valued a French translation of the Psalms. It's a very personal gift. So yeah, it's very interesting to imagine that it might have been George who gave that to her.
I like that. So are there any other revelations that you made in this research that we haven't covered?
So at the moment, those two. Well, so the redating was one as well, which isn't one that I intended to go into. As I say, the manuscript has historically been dated to 1529 and 1532. And then I was able to track down the source text of it, which wasn't published till 1531. So that narrows the window ever so slightly of when it would have been commissioned. That's quite exciting, if you're a nerd like me and like precise dates like that. But yeah, that's 3 kind of revelations that were uncovered. And with the binding one, I think it's less of I wouldn't call it discovery or even a revelation. It was basically just a new way to look at this binding. I was quite literally just sitting at home one evening, having finished my dissertation, and the paper was on its way to being published, and then I just thought, what about binding? That's interesting. And then a whole new avenue of research opened up. But I think there's definitely scope for more to be done with the manuscript. I don't know enough about translations. I don't know enough about the Psalms. I don't know enough about kind of vernacular translations at this period to delve into that as an avenue of research. But there's definitely a lot more that can be done. And maybe we can fill that gap as well, that gap of provenance that I wasn't able to fill.
Let's do it.
I think that's all of it. Yeah, I think that's all of it when it comes to that manuscript, though, in terms of like the revelations that it was able to offer. But it is just a beautiful item, and if anyone got to see it at the National Portrait Gallery, where it was quite recently, in London, you would know. It's lovely. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I Yeah, with the paper that was recently published on its binding, that is behind a paywall, but I do have a couple of free e-prints. So if anyone wants to read it or see pictures of the binding, happy to share it because it's beautiful. It's
Yes.
lovely.
It is lovely. And anytime you have something that's that old, something that's that precious, like the brilliance of the color to me is always the best part when you see those images from the inside and there's just these bright colors popping at you. It just blows your mind that they've survived that for so long.
Yeah, it really does. It's so beautiful and remarkable that it's 500 years old. And like I say, it looks like it could have been decorated, yesterday. The gold
Yeah.
leaf still shines as it did. The ink is still so colourful and bright. Yeah, it really is remarkable. And the fact that to go back to George, actually, oh, that's something. To go back to George as the commissioner, when you think about the intertwined initials of Henry and Anne, that also is a very personal thing, and it is we see the same emblem in the Harley manuscript of the British Library, which was digitized, but obviously now with the cyber attack on the British Library, I don't know if they've put those images back up, but if you Google it, it does come up. That's the same intertwined initials you see in both manuscripts, which is what initially alerted me to the possibility. I was looking at James Carley's book on the subject, and he was the one who put forth the theory that it was George who gave Anne the Harley manuscript in the British Library. And all it was seeing the same symbol in that one and thinking, I saw that in Anne Psalter. Could it possibly be both?
Yeah.
Because it would have had to have been somebody remarkably close to Anne to give her a manuscript with the HA intertwining initials in 1531 or possibly 1532. Someone close enough to her to do that. So that's very interesting as well.
That would make sense if it were her
Yeah.
brother.
Yeah, yeah, and it's that as well. Beautifully done, black ink. The shield behind it is sort of like a dark grey brown color. The angels that are holding the shield up and the full page illumination are just so bright and vibrant. It really is beautiful.
You know, we've had you on the show before, as you alluded to at the beginning here. And the first time you came on the show, we talked about Elizabeth Boleyn. And I think we need an update on how things are looking for your Elizabeth Boleyn book.
Well, things are looking really, really good. Just before we started this Zoom call this evening, I got an email from my commissioning editor at the History Press to say that she has read the first draft of the manuscript and that it's all good, which is a massive relief because
Yay!
you never quite know, do you? You never quite know when you've been labouring away at something by yourself. What if it's actually terrible and they hate it? But
Right.
that's not the case. So we're moving forward with the process of publishing. We're looking at a publication date of October of this year. So very soon, that's going to go very quickly.
Oh,
Yes.
October is my birthday month. So if by chance you want to release it on, let's say, October 8th, I wouldn't be too upset about it.
We will see. I'll see. I don't know. It's out of my control.
Oh, I'll contact the publisher. I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
you
I'm
tell the
just
History Press,
kidding.
listen, it has to. Yeah, so
Listen.
that's the update.
Well,
It's
this is
yeah, so very soon. Very soon with
yes,
the book.
very soon. And I know there many people who are listening today are very excited about your research on this and all the research that you've been doing that you've been sharing with the audience. Like it's been so fun getting to know you and to see what you're passionate about. So thank you so much for doing that with us.
So much, and it's always a joy. I love chatting to you. I love it. It's so fun, and I felt so kind of bursting onto the scene with a debut book of this biography of a woman that everyone says, oh, there's not much to know, is there? It does feel like quite a big step. And when you're talking about Anne Boleyn as well, people feel so passionate and strongly about it. So that's lovely of you to say. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed chatting to you and sharing the research. It's
Thank
great.
you. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tutorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.